Hello and welcome to the WIHS Journal, Public Affairs from 104.9 FM. I'm Paul Kretschmer. Today and tomorrow we'll be discussing climate change and energy change here in the States and around the world. My guest on today's broadcast is called Tom Bowman, and he operates a business to address the whole issue of climate change and energy.
I started the business because I had an epiphany about the nature of the climate crisis. I was doing science museum exhibits, and I realized that people who do communications for a living needed to be involved in more projects than just museum exhibits. So I opened this consultancy and ultimately sold my design business so I could work on this.
Okay. What kind of background or education did it require you to pursue that line of work then?
Yeah, I have a background. I have a master's degree in social ethics and an art degree, and I was an exhibit designer, which means I'm a communication professional for about 25 years. And along the way, I essentially had a private education in climate science from some of the most eminent climate scientists in the world, because they were my clients at the National Academy of Sciences and the Birch Aquarium at Scripps Institution of Oceanography. So I just took it upon myself to learn the material and to become a student of theirs in order to interpret their work accurately.
Is there a difference between the institutions that you interacted with and popular places, you might call them, like the Connecticut Science Center in Hartford, which is very much a hands-on place that families go to?
Right. Some of the work is similar. The difference between those two institutions that I mentioned is that they are part of scientific research organizations. And so the exhibits serve the purpose of explaining the scientific research that the scientists do there to the public. So it's very, very high-level scrutiny and content, definition for these kind of exhibits at those institutions.
Could you tell me what kind of query or what kind of interest you took that caused you to interact as extensively as it appears you did with many of the professionals that you've mentioned at the top of our conversation?
Yeah. So in 2003 and 2004, I was invited to create a museum in Washington, D.C. for the National Academy of Sciences. And that's, the idea of creating a brand new museum in the nation's capital is something that no exhibit designer would ever say no to. And so I learned climate science there, and the attitude among the scientists was pretty much that, this is a serious issue, but thank goodness we have time. People are wise. We won't make foolish decisions. When I was invited to do my second climate science project, literally just 2 years later, at the Birch Aquarium, the attitude among the scientists had really changed because the pace of warming in the Arctic had really, really accelerated, and the emissions were rising, particularly in China because of their economic development, at an alarming rate. And it was when I sort of awoke to just how deeply we are already into a changing world that I felt a calling to work on this problem.
Would you say that things have accelerated much more rapidly even since that point at which you sort of had your epiphany in that regard?
Yeah, I would say so. Back in the early 2000s, the IPCC would issue reports that had a series of scenarios looking at the future, trying to predict how the climate would warm. And you can't know how society and economies will evolve. So they ran a range of scenarios from rapid transition away from fossil fuels to the worst case scenario, which is the world doesn't cooperate and we burn fossil fuels like crazy. Since 2010, the trajectory in emissions has been as bad as that worst case scenario, and that's something that none of the scientists ever really thought would happen.
It seems like not only the pace of development is in certain regards, and I use that phrase as a general term, not an editorial comment about whether it's good or bad, but simply that it is.
Mm-hmm.
Not only does it seem to be going much faster developments, but it's almost like we've hit a tipping point someplace. So rather than a slow or moderate range movement forward, it's like we go up to a point and then fall off a cliff. And when I think of that, I think of a pandemic that the whole world's been tied up with for over a year now, and things like how warm it is, as you mentioned earlier, in the northern and southern poles of the country, and in places like Texas as we speak, where it's difficult for Northeasterners like me to conceive of a place like Texas
yes, of course,
that is so cold, and where the power management is so lacking at the moment for whatever reason, that it actually puts many, many people in imminent danger.
Well, this is really the pernicious problem with climate change, because our infrastructure is designed for the climates that we live in, right? And so the entire energy system in Texas is built for a place that's hot, and where in February the average temperature is in the 60s, not 25 to 40 degrees below that number. So their grid system isn't as winterized as it would be where you live in the Northeast. And this is the nature of the kind of battles that we're going to be facing with climate change, because it means that the infrastructure we've built for the places we live is built for a climate that's in the rearview mirror, and we're going to have to figure out how to adapt to a climate that's quite different from that now.
In some ways, it seems to me, Tom, that we've been facing situations such as in Texas that are reminiscent of a film that came out a few years ago, where the climate of the country changed and the northern half of the country became almost unlivable, and everyone headed south, where they assumed it would be warmer. Are we facing that kind of doomsday scenario as far as you can see based on what you've learned over the course of time, or is that still just a hair of an exaggeration?
Well, let's say that it's that particular scenario was scientifically unrealistic, but the fact that we're headed for catastrophe is very, very real. The one really crucial caveat is that it's within our control. In other words, the latest research shows that if we were to stop burning fossil fuels quickly, let's say the whole world stopped burning fossil fuels today, the climate would stabilize at today's level. We wouldn't see aggressive warming continuing into the future. So it is really in humanity's hands, and the reason I've written about this lately is because I think the narratives that we have been struggling with in our politics and in our own sense as people about what we should do about this problem have been leading us to despair rather than hope and determination.
I find that an interesting concept, in the sense that quite often what I see in the popular press is either we're going to ignore what we can see in front of us because it doesn't match up with anything we've seen before, or it's already too late and now it's just a matter of waiting till our parachute hits the ground, if we have a parachute.
Yeah, well, think of it this way. We are creatures of habit, right?
Right.
Our minds evolved to assume that the future will be like the past, so the things that have worked for us before are likely to work for us going forward. And so we have a real bias against change. And on top of that, we've been taught about climate change from mostly climate scientists, and their job is to study these really complex global and interacting systems, the ocean, the atmosphere, the land, the polar ice, all of that, and it's really complex. And it's more complex than most of us can understand. They've also, the continuation of that conversation to what we can do about climate change has followed that same model. Just think of a Gordian knot of global transportation systems and food production and supply chains and governance and international financial markets. All of that, urban infrastructure, agricultural practices.
Tom Bowman is my guest on today and tomorrow's WIHS Journal broadcast. For further information, call us at 860-346-1049. The opinions expressed are those of the participants, not necessarily those of the staff or management of the station. I'm Paul Kretschmer on the WIHS Journal, Public Affairs from 104.9 WIHS.